Good evening to everyone, and thank you for joining us online. My name is Michael McCarthy. I'm the Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Science, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's final Science at Melbourne public lecture for 2022. I wish to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the unceded land I am on today, the Wurundjeri people. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where all our audience members are joining us from today, and acknowledge that Indigenous Australians have been custodians of the lands and waterways of Australia for thousands of years. I acknowledge and respect the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as this country's first scientists with deep and enduring knowledge of the land, waters and skies, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Science has always been at the forefront of answering life's big questions. The recent global pandemic and the growing pressure on the Earth from global warming remind us that science's role is important now and will continue to be important. During tonight's conversation, we will explore the rapidly changing scientific landscape and the careers that will underpin these emerging areas. Our expert panel tonight consists of three outstanding scientists: Associate Professor Nick Geard, Dr. Stacey Rudd and Christina Fitzsilis, who will each bring their unique insight to tonight's conversation. Each will offer their own perspectives as they draw on their experiences in the industry and the skills that they think are needed to future-proof the careers of the next generation of scientists. We're also very pleased to have David Rogers joining us tonight to moderate the panel discussion. David is the manager of the Careers and Industry team in the Faculty of Science here at the University of Melbourne. The Careers and Industry team curates and creates internships, research projects and events to strengthen the professional competencies of the faculty students through engagement with our industry partners. Prior to joining the university in 2019, David worked in the US in life sciences and technology organizations in roles across project management, training and development, and leadership development, in addition to working in tertiary education. And it's with pleasure that I hand over to David.
Thank you, Mick. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's joining us tonight. I would also like to begin by acknowledging that I too am coming from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the land that I'm on this evening. Before I dig into the introductions of our panelists, I'd like to cover the format of tonight's event. So imagine instead of us sitting here on Zoom, we're all having a fireside chat. It's Melbourne, even though it's spring, summer, it could still be winter at any moment. So, and we all have a glass of our favorite beverage and having a nice conversation. We just also happen to have an audience, providing some questions to guide this conversation. So think of it more informal than as opposed to a formal. It's kind of the intent we have here. The online attendees, when you submit your questions, you will notice the webinar chat has been disabled. Please submit the questions you have for our panelists using the Zoom Q&A function. If you see a question has already been submitted and you'd like to hear that question asked, you can use the upvote option, or you can direct, and also you can direct your questions to one specific panel member or to the panel as a whole. Now, I want to introduce our three panelists. Once I've finished with their introductions, they will turn on their cameras and join me on stage at the fireside chat. First is Dr. Stacey Rudd, is an early career researcher in the School of Chemistry here at the University of Melbourne. Her scientific interests are inorganic chemistry, radiochemistry, and cell biology. After completing her PhD in 2018, she's continued her research into metal-based pharmaceuticals for cancer diagnosis and therapy and established multiple commercial research partnerships leading to two of the pharmaceuticals that she's developed entering clinical trials. So good evening, Stacey, and thank you so much for joining us. Nick Geard is an associate professor within the School of Computing and Information Sciences, or Systems, also here at University of Melbourne, where his team used computational and mathematical models to understand how infectious diseases spread. As part of the Doherty Institute's modeling group, his team's work helps informs the national response to the COVID-19 pandemic. As if that doesn't keep him busy enough, Nick is also the director of the Melbourne Data Analytics Platform, MDAP, a team of 20 research data science specialists enabling data-intensive research across the University of Melbourne. Welcome, Nick. And our third panelist, Christina Bitzilis, is a clinical account manager at Illumina. And Illumina is a biotech company that develops, manufactures, and markets integrated systems for the analysis of genetic variation and biological function. Prior to working at Illumina, Christina spent 5 years in clinical genomics laboratories before moving to industry. Over the last 4 years at Illumina, she's worked closely with translational and clinical molecular labs to drive adoption of emerging genomics applications across oncology, microbiology, agriculture, and hereditary disease. So thank you to all of our panelists for joining us this evening, and welcome to the stage as you turn on your screens and cameras. So again, thanks and welcome. So before we dive into tonight's focus, which is emerging industries in science, let's spend a few minutes getting to know each of our panelist members a little bit better to generate some questions as we go. So I've shared the bios, which contains lots of technical information. However, we think about how would you explain, maybe in simpler terms, about what you do, maybe to a non-scientist family member. How would you explain it so they would understand? And let's go in order of maybe introductions. Stacy will start.
Sure, thanks, David. So my research is really trying to develop new drugs for cancer. And what I'm really interested in, it sounds kind of intense, we're using radioactive metals to treat and diagnose cancer. And so it's a bit of a new area, but it's got a whole lot of potential and we're really excited about it. That's it in a nutshell, I think.
That's awesome. Yes, thank you. Nick.
Sure. Okay. I used to have this problem before COVID, and people would ask me what I did, and I would say, well, you know how before you decide what you're going to do on the weekend, you'll look at the weather forecast to see if it's rainy or sunny and make your decision based on that. And I would sort of use that analogy. To be honest, I don't really have that problem anymore. All of a sudden, everybody's an expert in my field. What I would say is that it's really about using the tools that we have on hand, and sort of computers, mathematics. We want to both understand what it is that's happening to us, what has happened in the past, and we want to use that information and that understanding to be able to help the people who make decisions that affect us in our everyday lives when we're living through something like the COVID pandemic, to make the most informed possible decisions to help really sort of achieve the best possible outcomes.
Nice. And I guess, you've been with infectious diseases back before COVID, so it's like before it was really a cool thing to talk about, which is great.
Yeah, I'm like a hipster, in that respect.
You are so revolutionary or ahead of your time there, Christina, let's hear a bit about how would you explain what you do to a non-scientific family member?
Thanks, David. I think similar to Nick, my role became really obvious to my family when COVID-19 came around, because essentially our technology at Illumina was the technology that actually sequenced the COVID-19 genome. And that's what, I guess, started to develop things like vaccines and contact tracing and wastewater. And so what my role at the time of, maybe I'll use COVID as an example, was we had the technology, and I guess the labs needed to adopt new methodologies in order to, I guess, instill these new applications into the community. So I really worked closely with not only research labs, but clinical labs to sort of work out where they want to go with their research, but then in parallel, in the clinical side of things, work out what tests are in demand and how that can be, I guess, apply to genomics and vice versa. So we sort of tap into each area of the industry, from agriculture to cancer treatment to sort of everyday hereditary disease. So it really depends on making sure you sort of understand what the end user wants to do and kind of connect that with new awesome technology and I guess innovation in that space as well.
Nice. So now that we know kind of what you're doing today, let's understand a little bit about the journey that got you to here where you are. So and think back, I guess, at what age did you first think about, I want to be a scientist? And maybe what age did you commit to that, I want to be a scientist? And those could be two very different timelines. Let's go reverse order this time. Christina, there we go.
Awesome. I think I was always someone who was just interested in science. I just thought it was really cool. And I think it was my year 9 science teacher, I forget his name, and I probably should shout him out, but he sort of introduced me and was really enthusiastic about what science was, you know, learning about, I think the first time you see that picture as a kid from how the apes turn into the humans, you know, that classical tree. And it was that was like, oh, this is a cool area. And suddenly a lot of things in the world made sense, like why your body did certain things, why the environment did certain things. And so I knew that, you know, I was someone as a student who liked to have the answers to everything, and science just put a lot of answers into perspective when it came to sort of explaining why it rains and, you know, why certain things happen in the world that were previously unexplainable in my life. So I think I always was interested in science, and then committed to that. Being a scientist just fits, because when you enjoy something and then you also realize that you're actually pretty good at it, you're really, really good at it because you enjoy it. And so those two things go hand in hand. So and I probably quickly realized I didn't want to be a scientist maybe, and realized that I liked science, and I'll use my skills that I've learned and transfer them into other areas. So maybe that's the opposite to your question.
We'll talk about the skills a little later in the evening, I anticipate. So let's see, Nick, I think we'll go reverse. So I think you're next here.
Sure. So I guess as a kid, I was always into computers. I just loved sort of tinkering and programming, and, you know, sort of creating, the idea of creating worlds inside a computer was always fascinating. And so that was what I studied when I got to university. But I think the, you know, university almost cured me of that. I came out sort of with a strong desire not to work in the IT industry, and sort of, you know, computers as an end in themselves, I sort of started to find really boring. But I also took subjects in a bunch of other areas, and in particular cognitive science, where you were sort of working in the intersection of psychology and philosophy and linguistics and computing, made me realize that, you know, computers could also just be this tool for discovering and understanding the world around us. And I think that was kind of what drew me back into the scientific aspect of computing. And I did a PhD in sort of modeling cells and genes, and I postdoc in modeling social networks. And then when I landed in came to Melbourne about 10 years ago to work in infectious disease epidemiology, that was kind of like where everything came together. It was, you know, understanding all of these different systems in the world, from, you know, the evolution of bacteria, through immune systems, through to social systems, through to, you know, the political and ethical implications of the tools that we use to control disease spread. And in computing, we had a sort of a method, an approach that we could take to sort of pull together all these diverse data sets and really ask questions that were both scientifically interesting, you know, how does the world work, like Christina mentioned, but also questions that were highly relevant from a policy perspective. You know, how can we use this knowledge to, you know, to help, you know, as I said before, make, you know, good decisions. And so I think that was kind of my pathway to sort of coming back into science. It was computing, but computing as a tool to understand the world around us.
Nice. Thanks. Stacey.
So my story is a little bit different. I certainly did not know that I wanted to be a scientist for a long time. I actually finished high school and thought, oh, I'm done with studying. I never want to do that again. I didn't want to go to uni, and I actually worked in magazine publishing for a long time. But after a while, I kind of found that wasn't really what I wanted. It wasn't quite, you know, where my passions were. And I was kind of lucky enough to have a lot of really supportive people around that were kind of like, Stacey, why don't you go to uni and give that a shot? I think you could do it. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, I'll try it out. And so I kind of thought, what do I want to do? I thought back to high school, and I had really loved doing biology back in high school. It was kind of around the time of the Human Genome Project kind of finishing up. So that was a really big thing then. And I remembered really loving learning about like DNA and how it all works. I was like, oh, that was really cool. Maybe I can do something with that. And so I did a Bachelor of Science, and I was doing genetics for a long time, but eventually kind of slowly moved over to the chemistry side and figured out that that was really what I thought was just really cool, like really detailed kind of things that I was looking for that just fascinated me. And then I didn't really know what I was going to do with that for a long time. And so I thought, oh, it's pretty cool. I'll maybe continue on. I did a master's degree because I thought maybe if I want to go into industry, get a job, that might be really good. So I had planned to kind of do my master's and then that's it. But it turned out I loved my research project during my master's. So it kind of all stemmed from that. I think that was kind of when I was like, oh, I think I might really like this. So I continued on, did a PhD, I've stayed in research since, and lucky I did, because I think it's been a really good decision. But yeah, it took a little while to get there.
Okay. Yeah, I love hearing the different journeys it's all taken, and we'll, I'm sure dig a little more into that. One thing actually, as we were chatting yesterday with Christina, kind of this question came up, and I kind of phrased it of, being a scientist and when you grow up, and she kind of made a really valid point that she's still growing up, and that, I think that's really important point.
I said that to you in confidence, David.
But no, I it's really important point that we are also growing up, and it gotta really, I hope we continue to grow and learn. That's part of the, I think, human experience and part of science. When we think of back to the theme of the topic tonight is emerging industries in science and emerging careers. And so I think that continual growing, continual emerging is part of really the key to this. And so before we get into some of the more detail, some of the other questions, I want to kind of maybe take a broader lens, maybe a little more philosophical thought here is, when you think of industries that are emerging, what exactly comes to mind? Like, how would you define an emerging industry? Or maybe at what point does an industry not emerging? What's that kind of line there? And then I guess another element, as you kind of discuss this, is aren't all science industries to some extent emerging due to the evolving technology and new discoveries? So with that really big question of what is emerging, when is something not emerging, and who wants to, I'll let you volunteer for this, and as opposed to calling on you for this one.
I might go first because I can answer your question in an interesting way, or a different way maybe to the others, where half the reason why I didn't want to pursue a career in the lab, I didn't go on to do my master's and I didn't go on to do my PhD. I guess when I finished my undergraduate, I just wanted to, similar to Stacey, thought I'll just get out there and get a job and see what sticks, and worked in a clinical hospital and sort of learnt the hospital system, and went to another private lab and learned that system. But I realized in my time that what was emerging then was genomics, and that was obviously my own biased opinion. And everyone I spoke to, again, it stemmed from that Human Genome Project as well that Stacey spoke about, where everyone sort of knew genomics was cool and saw that there was so much to do, and it was sort of popping up in, I guess, bespoke ways in a healthcare system, whereas now it's a lot more front of mind and a lot more accessible. And so that's why I sort of pursued a direction into the genomics world, went back and did some studies, because I didn't do that in my undergraduate, because I saw that genomics was an area that sort of stemmed across every single aspect of life. Obviously computer and data science really feeds into that as well. You can't have one without the other. And that whole aspect of automation and infrastructure and technology advancement, it was always, in my mind, stemming back to a genomics landscape. In hindsight, I probably would have gone back and done data science, but at the time, that was my thought process.
I might jump in after that then, because I think my perspective probably segues quite nicely from Christina's, and I was going to really emphasize the key role that data is going to play and the analysis of data is going to play in future industries. And I'm sort of wearing my MDAP hat now as well as my epidemiology hat. But one of the things that MDAP is doing is really helping the university, but more broadly, think about all of the different sort of ways in which data exists in our society and what we can gain from turning data science or computational or artificial intelligence techniques onto that data. And obviously there are sort of positive outcomes from this in terms of automation. There are risks associated with this, and I think there's a greater recognition now of the importance of I guess taking a very holistic view of how we introduce new technologies into society, and that sort of with a core around data. I think that interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary perspective on how we analyze data, how we use data, how we develop technologies that are going to change our lives is becoming more recognized. And I think there's an increasing, or where we're going to see emerging roles within industries is in people who can actually think about the solutions that are being proposed in that really broad way.
Great.
And I might jump off a bit of what Nick just said there about how new technologies and things are being integrated into sort of our existing systems and how it's all going to work. Certainly, I guess in my line of work, when we're talking about what's emerging and what's not, it's kind of all a little bit on that borderline between the two. And I've really found that it's been really interesting seeing everyone kind of strike a balance between the two. That the kind of research that we do in the lab is obviously quite emerging new things that we might not really have the technologies or the setup to do in scientific industries already, but we're kind of trying to get those both going sort of at the same time. And I think the timing with that is really important as well. So I think that's going to be really interesting to see how we can keep kind of matching those two things together.
Well, and as Nick was mentioning, there's a lot of times the multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary words kind of keep coming through. A lot of things I hear these days are quite commonplace. I mean, you have bioinformatics and climate science. Data is everywhere. Every company, even small businesses, have data they need to figure out about their customers. And so I guess when you think of you probably, as universities, are quite specialized in their majors and their studies. Now that you're in a industry or as a researcher or as an academic, how do you find yourself navigating the diverse other fields you're working with? Branching into new knowledge. I guess what does that kind of look like for you in your day-to-day activities?
Okay, I'll jump in first this time. I would say it's absolutely integral to everything I do, and it's the one of the great joys of the job is just getting to interact with people across all of these different fields. And the next best thing to being able to do everything yourself, I guess, is to work with the people who are doing everything and having sort of some level of engagement and involvement with that. It was one of the things that drew me into, as I mentioned, infectious disease epidemiology. It was one of the things that drew me towards MDAP as well. And I think as I say, it's increasingly important. I think one of the key skills that people working in science can benefit from taking into that new world is the ability to communicate about what they do and what their field is, particularly to people outside of their field. I think it's natural within a university environment, an educational environment, that you learn more and more about increasingly sort of specialized areas, and you get sort of habituated towards being able to communicate very precisely about those areas in very technical language, but then being able to take that understanding and those insights back and talk to someone from the building next door, or someone outside of the university, or someone in industry, is really where there are huge gains to be made in terms of sort of unlocking the knowledge that we have and linking it up with the the insights and the knowledge that people have across a whole range of different areas.
Okay. Christina or Stacey, want to add?
I might jump in. I absolutely couldn't agree with Nick more. All of the research that I've been a part of has been so incredibly multidisciplinary. We've got people from all different kind of fields, and they're all completely integral to what we do. We wouldn't be able to do it all without them. And part of that is because you can't be an expert in everything. you can't do all of the different jobs that you need for these kind of projects to go along. And getting that kind of insight from someone who does work in those fields is really important. I mean, for me particularly, because I work in medical research, being able to actually speak with the clinicians who are working with patients and see what their needs are is probably one of the most important things, and what the patients need as well, which is, you know, a really important perspective when you're trying to plan a project and choose a direction to go. And you need to be able to really effectively communicate with all of these different people who have very different knowledge to you. You know, I speak regularly with physicists and immunologists and doctors and everyone, and yeah, everyone's quite good, at least, at explaining things to me that I don't understand. But yeah, it takes a bit of practice, I think, to be able to do that about your own field. But it's so important, absolutely integral.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Stacey. I think even in my role, you know, not in research, but I guess I really rely on people like yourself to be open and collaborative about what it is that you want to achieve to mean that we can do our job. But I think what we've sort of seen, especially during COVID, is people, I think nowadays, and especially with technology, are more open to collaborating. Especially because if you stay silent in your own seat and you don't want to share your work because you want to be able to announce the most groundbreaking piece of information, you know, while that still holds true, I think you're not sure on what gaps you're missing, and having different sets of eyes look at your work in different ways, or asking questions in a different way to, like, someone, like you said, like a physician versus a data scientist. They're all going to give you a different answer, and you're only going to learn. You either accept their answer and you take it on board, or you do nothing with it. But you're always going to learn more when you sort of collaborate and sort of transfer your skills to other areas and all work together. Which sounds really corny, but it's really the way that the world is supposed to work. You know, you work as a team, not as an individual, and that's how it's supposed to be.
It's amazing how often the collaboration or working with others is not the norm. You know, like it's not the way it works sometimes. And so it's great to hear that that is such an important element for all of you. So we've got some questions starting to come in from the audience. And so the first question is a question from Kevin, who has just finished an online course on data analytics and also did a BSc majoring in pathology 5 years ago. So his question is, what emerging fields are there that are a cross between healthcare and data? It's a long list, I'm sure.
So many jobs. I think I'm sorry, I'm going to jump in, but because I wish I did data science at uni. So I really envy anyone who's done the smart thing and in my opinion, and taken that on board. I think in the world of pathology and data science, it's a lot of it does sit into, there's different avenues, and it's not linear like I was once taught. You don't just go to the lab and then become a lab manager and that's it. It's, you know, you can really step into places like health economics, which I guess is something that requires not only data, but a bit of a business mindset in terms of how the healthcare system works, how policy works, and then also how, you know, data then defines how we move forward. Other areas and that are obvious would also be something like a variant curator, which are in such high demand at the moment, and every lab is crying for them, which is, I guess, for those on the call who that's a new term. A variant curator is someone who is responsible for the analysis and the interpretation of, I guess, complex genomic data, and whether that is for reporting of results, but typically for stratifying patients' therapies, or it could be for in the areas of COVID-19. And I think that's an area where those two of the background does kind of connect there. And the other one, which sits somewhere in between health economics and variant curator, is a genetic counselor. And again, requires data science, requires pathology knowledge, requires pretty extensive background into the health, or this is all sort of humans, and then applying that into a counseling setting to kind of, I guess, walk patients through why they would want certain results or not certain results. And I think probably the most obvious one, or the one in the news at the moment, is Chris Hemsworth talking about how he's got high risk for Alzheimer's disease, and a genetic counsellor would have been pretty, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Pretty key into his decision as, do you even go for a test and what are the outcomes? And that does rely on a lot of pathology and data science. So one of the things I should have done if I went back to uni as well on that list.
As a shameless plug, Christina, it's not too late to go back to school and get a master's or a grad cert.
Yeah.
I just completed my master's at the University of Melbourne, and I have a few more gray hairs than you do, so not too late.
I really hope I've got none. That's the goal I'm going for. On you.
Maybe to give another perspective on that intersection as well, I think here we have a program in digital health, and sometimes referred to as health informatics, which is precisely that intersection between data analysis skills and applied in the healthcare domain, and the educational programs that the university offers take on people from both a clinical background as well as from a sort of computational statistical background, and look to bridge that gap. But I would say there's a growing demand in a huge range of different areas there. To add a few more examples to Christina's, so thinking about clinical data that's collected, whether it be images from scans or whatnot, and using sort of artificial intelligence data analytics techniques to analyze those and to help support clinical decision making, through to hospitals are another incredibly complex system, and a huge amount of data is collected during the functioning of a hospital, and we've now got sort of electronic medical health records. There's a vast amount of data there with great potential to be to unlock the value of that, but also a need for a very sort of nuanced, considered perspective about how privacy is ensured, how how we avoid using that data to how equity is maintained and things like this. So I think there's a really wide open space there in terms of, well, wide open, but being filled by increasing amounts of research into just how we make use of the amount of all of the data that is generated in the healthcare system. So yeah, I think you're in the right place.
I'll just jump in there as well. I'm really glad you said that, Nick, because certainly I would say in the clinical trials that I've been involved in, I keep hearing people say, we have too much data. What are we going to do with all this data? We need people who can help us analyze all of this. It's so complex, and you end up generating so much. I think that there's a lot of room for that in hospitals, especially research hospitals. It's absolutely in demand. So good choice on your decisions there for the data science.
Well, I often get in my hat at the uni of manager careers in industry, students asking, so how do I start? I guess if you were, talking to a student who's now really ready to, as Kevin's like just finished, he's ready to now start applying for jobs. How does he find these jobs, these careers, and know what they even are? Any suggestions on that?
I went first last time, so Stacey, maybe you can go first.
I'm sorry, my internet cut out just for a second there, but I think you were asking about how to find these roles.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would definitely say that certainly during my career as well, I keep coming across roles that I didn't even know existed, and it's pretty amazing. Sometimes I think, oh wow, that's a really good job. Maybe I should have done that. But I think in terms of where to find them, I guess I think a lot of these are advertised. Certainly the ones that I was mentioning before about the hospitals and clinical trials, they are advertised on a lot of the kind of general job seeking websites. But I think as well, you've done your bachelor and you've done this other course. You probably know some people who might be involved. Maybe talk to them, see if they know of anything that's coming up. Yeah, I'm not sure if the others have some more suggestions. I think they might know a bit more about the big data kind of jobs than I do.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can point to specific resources, but I would sort of echo that the role of sort of serendipity, I think, in these types of sort of science and emerging career paths can't be underestimated. I think there's a lot to be said for being open to new possibilities that you might not have considered. I think, you know, we tend to come out of a university thinking that we've trained for a particular role and then go looking for jobs in that role. I mean, I'm speaking from experience here. And sometimes it sort of takes a little bit of a kind of, oh, that's not quite working out for me. Hang on, you know, what can I do? And then you start sort of talking to people and hearing about things that you go, well, that's not quite what I thought I was going to do, but, you know, maybe that's worth trying. And I think you know, I'm sure there are statistics out there about like the average length of time that people, you know, tend to spend in the one job is decreasing over time. I think seeing all of the positions and all of the things that you do as kind of, you know, steps along a pathway towards something which is increasingly interesting. It feels like most of my career path has sort of been doing the next most interesting thing, even if I didn't realize that that was what I was heading for. And it's often only in retrospect that those things make sense. So I think when you're moving into these emerging industries, sometimes the position descriptions, the job titles don't necessarily match up to what you're looking for. So I think talking to people, looking really broadly across what the opportunities are and sort of, you know, taking a chance on things that you sort of go, well, I'm really interested in this. I may or may not be the most, you know, feel like I'm the ideal candidate. But probably if you feel like that and it's a new area and it's a new type of role, nobody feels like they're the ideal candidate, right? Or at least, you know, they're very rare to match. So I think giving those sorts of things a shot is the recommendation I would say.
I think, sorry, go ahead, Christina.
Oh, no, that's okay. I think I was going to agree, couldn't agree more, Nick. I think when I got my first role in genetics, I applied for it thinking, oh my God, they're never going to hire me. But I applied for it anyway, thinking if I have a job interview and I decide I don't like it, I actually don't have to take the job. And even if they offered it to me, I could always say no, and there's no harm in doing that. But I also accepted the fact that your first job isn't your last job. And you know, I've taken roles where there were backward steps or linear steps. It felt like that at the time. And in hindsight, they're not. And I think just accepting that, you know, you can't really force a career. You know the end goal, but the way that you're going to get there, you just can't force that sometimes because things happen in the world, pandemics happen. And I think just being resilient is probably the best thing you can do. But where to find the roles, they're not necessarily going to be thrown at you. But I think just giving it a go, even if you have to volunteer your time or do an internship to some degrees. I know that sounds like the most painful thing to do, but I volunteered my time for 40 weeks and I ended up getting a job out of it and couldn't sort of advocate more on the benefits of doing that.
And I actually saw a stat of the day that the average Australian has 5 to 7 careers in their lifetime. So, you know, it's not a till death do us part type thing, you know, and there is, I think, the normal expectation of it's a straight trajectory. But as I think you've all mentioned, you know, from working in magazines to, you know, different paths you've had, normal is quite twists and turns. And so I guess when you think of, you've talked a little bit about the resilience and being open to change. And when you think of an evolving industry such as science, what are those skills that students, new graduates should really be thinking about if they want to think about future proofing, another, you know, word we hear a lot of time, and those 21st century skills? You know, what would you recommend really be the areas to hone in on?
Okay, I'll jump in. I'm going to fall back on the really general ones that I think you know, any area of science will it will hopefully equip you with. And I think, you know, the importance of communication and the importance of communicating, you know, being able to communicate to a variety of audiences is really important. I think you know, curiosity, recognizing that in a multidisciplinary collaborative type environment, you may not necessarily know you won't know everything. And so being willing to sort of, you know, ask people questions about things and sort of just keep learning new ideas is a really key one. You know, critical thinking is you know, and I think critical thinking though in the context of being able to look at a really complicated situation, you know, the problems that are facing the world, you know, Mick talked about some of those in his introduction. They are big, you know, impossible problems with no silver bullet solution. And I think being able to sort of, confront that type of complexity and think about, okay, what can we do that sort of makes that a little bit more accessible, that helps us get a little bit of a handle on that, is really key. I'll stop there just to give the others a chance.
I can definitely agree with you, Nick. I think looking at in a different way. So I recently did an online LinkedIn course where we looked at identifying your own skills. And I think I learned a lot from that because David, I told you I'm growing up still. But I think it's important to kind of look back and actually identify what skills you do have. And if critical thinking isn't one of them, it doesn't mean that you're not going to have a career in science, because there are jobs, and even if it's things, we talk about communication a lot, if that isn't something that comes easy for you, or if you're someone who works a lot more independently, there are jobs that do suit, an independent contributor as opposed to a team contributor. And I think identifying what you're good at and elevating those or dialing them up. We tend to always focus on things we're not good at and trying to better them. But I think we also have to just take advantage of what you're good at, because it doesn't mean that everyone is good at those things. And Nick, you're probably really good at critical thinking and getting really deep and nitty gritty into the details. And sometimes I'm not very good at that. And so it's, I don't like to expose those areas. And so I focus on the things that I'm good at and sort of direct my role into, okay, I'm really good at this. How do I therefore, what will be my career path if I know that these skills are things that I can sort of advance and dial up.
Yeah. Can I just jump in to respond to that to an echo and say, I totally agree. And I think it's also what you actually enjoy doing. Yeah. Like, all jobs have different aspects. And you often find if you're doing something and going, look, I can do this, but I'm just not having fun on a day-to-day basis, then, we tend to get the most satisfaction, the most enjoyment out of what we're doing when we're, exercising something which we're actually good at. So I think that's really good advice to sort of, identify those things and look for the opportunities that match them.
Yeah, and I think it's important to acknowledge that, while Nick can do the deep diving critical thinking, Christina, that's not her strength, but every team needs both of those people on it. Like, you can't just have all Nick on a team, or all Christina. Like, it's, a team needs all kinds of individuals, and trying to remember that as you go through of like, I'm not Nick, and that's okay. I'm me, and every team needs a different thing. Right. Yeah. Stacey, do you want to add anything on skill sets for future proofing?
Yeah, I'm definitely with all of you on this idea of, kind of, knowing what you're good at and being able to bring that into your role, and bringing those skills in and helping out where you can in that sort of way. I think it's also, in these kind of emerging things that are coming up, you're going to be faced with a lot of things where no one on the team knows what to do next. And so just being able to kind of take a step back and think about that, and maybe start thinking about how you could find someone who knows how to answer your questions if you don't, or Nick doesn't, or Christina doesn't, or I don't. And I think, just being able to be a bit flexible with that as well. Yeah,
nice. Okay, we've got some more questions coming in. Let's see, a question from Nicole Reichelt. Can all panelists comment on their views on the role of science in funding and continuing basic research versus applied research? It's kind of a compound question. So, should we prioritize one over the other, considering the pressing problem we have in the world today? Or do we always need to have basic research running in the background, even though it may not have an immediate application, which is not easily commercialized or might end in failure?
I might jump in on this one if that's okay. I have strong feelings about this.
It seems like a Stacey question, and I'm just, just met you here, so yeah.
I have to say, basic research underpins everything that we do. Everything that we do, in my field, I'm a chemist. I make new drugs in the lab, and I can only do that because of the basic chemistry that people have come and done before me. So even though my projects might be related to more applied things, like getting things into the clinic, and making products that people actually use, I wouldn't be able to do it without the basic research. And in particular for me, for example, you know, even the things that I'm making in the lab I might have made them not even with a drug in mind. It might have been for a completely different project that wasn't applied. It was basic science. And it's only later on that you realize how useful it is for something else, because you never really know where things are going to go in research. And so I think funding both is equally important.
Yeah, I don't think
I'm sure that Nick has feelings about this too.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're really going to debate this one, right? I think everyone's going to be on the same side of the coin in the university perspective. You know, totally agree with Stacey. It's absolutely critical. You know, personally, I like doing applied because that sort of suits me. I always say that I'm not like smart enough to do kind of pure research. That's for the people who are really brilliant and that can make new discoveries. But I think it's, yeah, I can really only echo what Stacey says. It's absolutely critical to have that constant sort of source of inspiration, that flow of new ideas coming out of basic research that is driven by curiosity rather than the need to answer an immediate question, because that's the raw material that then gets fashioned into the applied research, you know, when we discover that we need it. And, you know, if we wait until we need it, you know, maybe it's too late.
Great points.
The only thing I'll add is probably that hot word that comes up all the time is commercialization. And I think there's a lot of noise in industry about intellectual property and commercialization and startups. And I think while that tends to overshadow basic research, it doesn't mean that it's not important. And so, you know, certain topics get more airtime in the media and in university sort of grounds, but, you know, doesn't necessarily mean that one's more important than the other. Just matter of context sometimes.
Okay. I guess to that, I often hear students that I work with talk about, you know, it's a failure. You know, I guess in science, when you think of failures, going through some of your experiences, what's your, I guess, perspective on failure? What defines a failure? Or are there such thing as failures and just learning opportunities? Who wants to?
I might. I feel like that one is pretty relevant to my line of work. I guess whether or not something is a failure or should you ever call it a failure, that's personal perspective entirely. You know, maybe if you set out with a specific purpose in mind and it didn't work the way you wanted to, maybe that's a failure. I would say, to give a specific example, you know, in a chemistry lab, we spend most of our day doing chemical reactions, mixing things together, hope that they make what we want to make, and 99% of the time they do not. It's normal. It's one of those things that when we get new students, we always have to reassure them and say, no, it's not you. This is research. You know, if everything worked the first time, it probably would have already been discovered and it would be out there. So, you know, I think you've got to take it on the chin a bit when things don't work. I hate to use the word failure, but when things don't work the way you expect or want them to. But I think that's part of science as well, is having that perseverance and a bit of that resilience to deal with the occasional heartbreaks that you might have in the lab or in terms of how your research is going. But there's also so many things that you can do with, you know, failures. And you never know where it's going to go. So I guess just keep an open mind with that as well. Yeah.
I think of, you know, as in the scientific discovery process, if you get to the end and get an unexpected result, it's not necessarily a failure unless you don't learn from it and don't apply that on the next round of research or applications. It's a continual learning loop as I see it. And so that's, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, absolutely.
So just thanks for kind of letting me kind of go with that. Nick, do you want to continue?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the other thing to remember too is that, you know, every person working in science has experienced that. You know, the most successful scientist who's up there winning a Eureka Prize or something, if you were to talk to them, they would have a long list of failures that they could tell you about. And I agree. I didn't want to mention it as a skill because I think it's more like a character attribute, but I think that notion of persistence or perseverance is a critical one, right? The ability to sort of be able to, you know, have a setback, you know, whinge and moan and complain about it, and then get up the next day and sort of go back to doing what you're doing and giving it another shot is it's not specific to science, but I mean it's a critical sort of survival skill.
Yeah, and what happens in that petri dish is not to be taken personal.
Indeed.
Christina.
I was just going to say, and Nick, you sort of touched on it, but in a general sense or a life sense, that no one really tells you how many times they've failed or what they classify as a failure. Everyone always puts up their best self. Go back to social media. No one puts, no one posts things online that don't highlight a positiveness in their life. So, it's the same thing for research. Although some people do make a career out of failures, and any research and development team or R&D team would like Stacey mentioned, would sort of, I guess, honor their whole career with all the mistakes that they make because it led to one amazing thing. So it's an unspoken maybe taboo about all the things that go wrong.
I'd seen kind of jokingly someone's CV or resume was listing all the failures instead of all the successes. Like it was kind of a parody on resumes and CVs. And but I'm like, yeah, it's actually really interesting to see the list of failures and acknowledging those publicly. We don't often do that. A couple more questions here from the audience. First of all, thanks to Kevin and Nicole for posting those. A question from Jocelyn. Do you have any advice for those starting their career in the biotechnology industry? I'm looking to work in the quality management or regulatory space. Do I need to have lab experience for this? And what pathways can I follow?
Well, I know someone who works in the quality regulatory space, and I was very interested in their role and how they got to their career at that point. And this is their pathway, not necessarily the only pathway, but they got to their career through working in a lab. And in the lab, they got involved with, or they were, I guess, appointed as the quality manager of that lab. And I guess that was their interest point and one of their skills, which they then moved into, I guess, quality and regulatory. And it's an area that I'm actually quite interested in. And I think it's having that certain type of mindset to look at data in a different way, to hone in on a situation and look at it with a regulatory or a QC standpoint. I would say that while it's not critical to have lab-based experience, it would help you understand a lot of the reasons as to why there is so much red tape in regulation and quality. And while it's not necessarily you need X amount of years, but it could just be, again, volunteering your time or having a mentor in that space. But again, that's only one example of a quality and regulatory pathway. But I think, just having that knowledge of why it's important. Perhaps you learned a lot of those skills at university already, but it's always really helpful to have industry perspective, because I guess what you learn at university, I found, was sometimes polar opposite to what happens in reality. And sometimes it wasn't the case, but it's always good to have a perspective on multiple different angles.
Anyone else on that before we move on? Nope. Okay, not your areas. Excellent. Let's see. The next one is kind of actually jumping to something Christina touched on, something Christina mentioned, is a question to all panelists. Do you have professional mentors? If so, how valuable have they been for supporting your career pathways? That's also from Nicole. So thanks, Nicole.
I'm happy to jump in on this one. So I guess I work in academia, right? So I'm going to count, the mentors that I have within academia as sort of professional mentors, and I would say critical. And I think here there are values to mentors both at a peer level, so other people who are going through the same experiences as you, as well as having sort of, I guess, that kind of mentoring of someone who's more senior and more advanced in their career path. I think, it's difficult to underrate the importance of those people, both in providing insight into opportunities that you might not have known existed. So we were talking before about how you find jobs, and I think just talking to people, finding people who are, if it's senior people, often people who are really interested in developing that next generation of people coming into the system and recognize the importance of, identifying and creating those opportunities. But also then, you know, the peer mentoring people, the people that you can kind of get together with from across the, you know, the industry or the university or the place that you work that you don't necessarily work directly with. I think giving that broader perspective on the experiences that you're having is also a sort of a really important and useful part of sort of career development and progression.
I might jump in next. I guess at Illumina, we have really structured mentor programs. Everyone comes from really vast careers and different backgrounds. And what I learned from that experience is I identified that I had mentors that were unofficial mentors. People I used to work with, some of my friends who are not in the industry, but they have, I guess, quite senior roles in their own industries that you sort of talked about different things. But what I've found recently is that you can't force a mentor. And while you might see someone and idolize their career path and want them to be a mentor, at the end of the day, you need to sort of find someone who understands you and where you've come from and your background and your personality. And sometimes you find that if that mentor has to be not necessarily a friend, but understand you from that level as well, because to give the right advice, I think they need to understand who you are. And so I've changed mentors a lot because you've got to find the right person, and no one takes offense to that. And I've also mentored others, and maybe they identify me as not the right person either, but I think it's very important to find a mentor, and having more than one for different parts of your skill set is not a bad thing either.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Having multiple mentors is really helpful. I wouldn't say I have any official mentors, but I definitely have them, and they just kind of happened quite organically. And, you know, the kind of thing where you sort of realize one day, hold on, are they my mentor? And it's really lovely when that happens, because it just means that, you know, they're supporting you, and they're giving you that kind of feedback and assistance that you need. And it means that they do it naturally, which is always really helpful, that's just their personality type. So there's certainly different avenues you can go down for more kind of official mentorship. And it was actually going to be one of the things that I was going to mention later on about having mentors. You know, as Nick said before, in academia, you tend to just have academic mentors, and that happens a lot. One thing that I do wish that I had done earlier on, when I was kind of figuring out where I really wanted to go, was to have maybe someone who was more industry focused rather than academia, university research focused, that could have helped me a little bit more to learn a bit more what it was like, because I really just had no idea, having not ever worked in there before. And yes, certainly finding about what kind of opportunities there would have been really helpful. So I might recommend that. But yeah, it's so essential. They help so much more than you even realize.
Well, I'm going to take this a little further in that, so you've obviously had great mentors, and Christina was talking about how the importance of finding the right mentor. I guess tips on how to find that mentor. How did you find yours throughout the years?
Mine kind of, like I said, just came about. So I'd say my main mentor was my supervisor from my master's, and then I did my PhD with the same supervisor, who was just so supportive and so helpful. And that just kind of, you know, I think happened naturally as a consequence of the sort of supervisor and student role that we had. But I find that it also comes about just by people that you meet throughout your career, and that you get along with very well, and you start talking about these things. And some people are just really naturally good, I think, at kind of helping you give you guidance on career and those kinds of things. So I think you kind of find them along the way. I feel like that's maybe not super helpful, but maybe just keep an eye out. You know, if someone is giving you some good advice, just like make a mental note of that and think, hey, actually, maybe this person, I should keep them around. They're really helping me. And maybe you can be a mentor to someone else as well.
Nice.
Building that, I would say it's okay to sort of ask someone as well. I mean, it's a bit weird to sort of say, hey, could you be my mentor? But I mean, it's perfectly fine to sort of say, you know, if you've identified someone who you think that could be useful, just saying, hey, look, can we go for a coffee sometime? I'd really love to talk about, you know, this. and you know, it's something that might feel a little bit awkward to begin with, but I think you know, as I start sort of moving into a position where people are asking me that question, discovering it's not actually awkward at all to receive a question like that from someone who's looking for advice. It's actually really rewarding to find someone who's proactive enough and motivated enough, who wants to sort of come along and listen to you babble on about, you know, yeah, your experience and your recommendations and your suggestions. So that's one tip. I think the other thing would be that, you know, so within the university, there are various mentoring programs that are run. You know, we have one within computing and information systems for students and for new staff. We have the, you know, I've participated in university-wide ones. These can sometimes be a little bit hit and miss. You know, you might get paired up with someone and you have a meeting with them, and, you know, maybe you don't click, maybe you don't gel. But I often find that even those sort of, you know, kind of like forced or structured mentoring programs can still have positive aspects, because oftentimes they're the ones that are going to perhaps link you up with someone who's a bit further away, who you might not have, you know, ordinarily interacted with. And sometimes that sort of, you know, totally independent perspective where you know it's not going to be sort of a lasting relationship, gives them the ability to give you the feedback that you really need to hear. Whereas someone who's a bit closer to you, you know, they might couch things a little bit differently.
Yeah.
The only thing that I'll add is I spoke to my manager recently about, you know, wanting to find a mentor for a particular area that I was lacking. And the first thing he said to me, but what do you want from your mentor? You know, you identify that this person wasn't the right mentor, why not? And this person is potentially the right mentor, and why? And I think it's that kind of opened up a different mindset, as I had so many expectations for what a mentor was going to do for me, and in reality, it's not the case. And I think, yeah, setting some realistic expectations on what you want from a mentor, because at the end of the day, most of the time I find mentors ask the mentee a lot of questions as well, as opposed to the other way around. And it's really about, you know, what do you want from them? And I think that's always important to set that expectation as well.
Yeah, have a clear vision in mind of what you want from that relationship going into it. I'm actually going to, we have a question that connects kind of to this. Question comes from Denton Bowles, who's a 1990s alumni, who is interested in the difference between institutional approaches to a degree for prospective students to gain industry experience. For example, RMIT appears to have a degree focus with industry experience units, while University of Melbourne appears to traditionally approach the experience through the honors. I am seeing internships may be another way to gain industry experience to help direct academic progression and career direction. Nick, you want to talk maybe a little bit about what your experience at UniMelb is, and I can talk a little bit about what my team and I do also?
Yeah, I mean, look, a lot of my experience with internships is going to be related specifically to being in computing and information systems. And so we have undergraduate students who come up through a Bachelor of Science. I think at that stage, there is an option to do an industry internship. I've certainly supervised Bachelor of Science students who've been interested in, you know, getting that sort of industry-like experience in another part of academia, like in the research industry. But there are also students who do go out to work in companies. And it's correct that the bulk of our internship experience, at least in the computer science programs and software engineering programs, is focused around at the master's level. So we have a lot of effort and a lot of local partners that we use to provide software engineering students with real world industry experience. But just also to add a comment from a broader perspective around that question, I guess the role of industry experience in setting sort of career directions and helping with career progression. I think the other thing that I would say is that, you know, internships are one way of getting that experience during your degree, but also to, you know, to sort of remember that you don't have to complete your entire educational pathway all in one fell swoop. You know, you can kind of go and do a little bit of education, go and get some, you know, some real world experience working. You'll go back and do the next stage of your education with a much clearer idea about what you want to get out of it. Probably a whole batch of new sort of, you know, organizational skills that you've picked up working in a, you know, in a real job. And I think, you know, that particularly when you're going into a research direction, you're going into a PhD, it's really valuable to have that broader context that the work that you're doing sort of, will ultimately contribute to help inform. So I think internships are one way, but also sort of, taking the opportunities that might arise in terms of just your overall sort of career pathway to sort of, flip-flop backwards and forwards between education and working is worth thinking about.
Yeah, and I know within the Faculty of Science, we have a internship option for both the undergrads as well as the masters. And so we have, it's something we really advocate for all students to complete. It's optional within all of the our degrees, but it is something that is a possibility for those. We also have a STEM mentoring program that pairs alumni with students, and so that's another option that we have available. And other faculties across the university also have internship options, and so that's something that is very much something we advocate. In our master's programs, there's industry projects in some of them, which are required industry year-long opportunity for 3 to 5 students to sit and work on a question that industry is posed and answer that for the year. And that's a great opportunity for students to get that experience and understanding that industry doesn't always know the answer, that sometimes it's a learning experience and journey for others also. So let's see, let me look at,
I'll just chime in there as well. A shameless plug here, but at Melbourne Uni a few years ago in chemistry, if there are any budding chemists out there, we did bring out a master's degree that's industry linked, and I just think it's the absolute best idea. It's one of those things that I wish it had been around when I did mine, because I would have absolutely jumped on it, and I highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in that. So I just thought I'd put that out there.
Excellent, thank you. So another couple questions here from the audience. So this comes from Elliot Bowden and might apply to Nick more than others, but is mostly open to all panelists. Neural networks are advancing in leaps and bounds, finding applications in ever more fields, and can already themselves act in place of scientific models in terms of predictive fidelity. They can be used to enhance the very hardware design that helps with their implementation and even their creation. They have more recently started to be used to actually create their own equations and actual scientific models. How much more do you believe we're going to see neural networks on various types and levels of sophistication in emerging areas of science? That's a mouthful.
Wow. Okay. That's almost like an essay.
Right.
Look, I think, it's neural networks I find really interesting, just from a historical perspective. I think they sort of, came about in the 70s and 80s. And then there was this long period of time where everybody thought that, that was a bit of a dead end as far as artificial intelligence.
Actually, from a kind of setting expectations, maybe quickly say what are neural networks if someone doesn't really understand what that is?
Sure, yeah, no, good point. So I mean, very briefly, I would say a neural network is basically a computational system that's inspired by the way our brain works. So our brain is made up of like billions of neurons that are all wired together, and everything that we do from a sort of a cognitive perspective is coordinated by some interaction of all of these neurons receiving input and passing that input on. And so a neural network is basically a computational implementation. You've got lots of sort of independently quite simple computing units, but if you wire enough of them up together and you train them in the right way, they can perform some fairly astonishing tasks, from sort of matching patterns to recognizing distinctions in images, and all the way through to now, some of you may be familiar with the sort of artificially intelligent generated art. And just last week, there was a new sort of chatbot sort of launched upon the world that is powered by some of these really powerful deep neural networks. And it just has quite a astonishing ability. You can type in any sort of prompt, and it's trained on lots of language texts, and it will give you back a response. I mean, perhaps as an example, I just cut and paste the question then into this chatbot, and to sort of read a small chunk of what it responds with. It says, it's likely that we will continue to see an increasing use of neural networks and other forms of artificial intelligence in the field of science. These technologies have the potential to help scientists analyze large amounts of data. And so you can see, this is just, that's not me speaking, that's me reporting what one of these neural networks has actually said in response to that question. So I would kind of agree with it insofar as it goes, in that I think the ability of these systems, and I think the recent success of these systems has been driven by the increasing availability of computing power, is going to be an incredibly useful tool in terms of data analysis. And I don't think you can ever take the human out of the loop, right? I don't think we're sort of at risk of a Terminator-like scenario where neural networks sort of take over the world. But I think we will see sort of increasing ways in which the sort of these computational systems will help to support the work that scientists do. And it's largely driven by the fact that, as others have spoken about, we have increasing amounts of data. And so we need tools that are able to work with that data, and neural networks are a tool that is able to take a lot of information, detect patterns in that information, and allow us to then make use of that information.
Thank you for explaining that.
Hopefully that didn't get too technical.
No, thanks for taking a step back for those of us who don't understand neural networks and putting some context around that. So thank you for that. Another question is from an anonymous attendee, asked, what advice do you have for students making the step outside of academia and into industry, or even for students finishing their degrees and taking that step into the working world?
I might take this one, seeing as I did exactly that. I would say that when I stepped out of the lab and into industry, in my opinion, I thought I was taking a huge risk, because I honestly didn't know what I was getting myself into. And I say that wholeheartedly, with absolutely no regrets. And I think, I guess, setting some expectations as to what you want out of the role, but I think aligning with the industry that you're moving into is probably really important. And so I've been at Illumina for 4 years and have had 4 different roles at that time, not necessarily because I've changed, but the market dynamics change, and I've moved with them. And so as long as you believe in the industry that you're moving into and you're passionate about it, then it doesn't really matter what job that you get at that industry, because it always changes so rapidly. And it's once you're in, it's easy to sort of move around as well. So I think, don't be afraid to take a risk, and it's completely daunting because it's so different to university, and I feel like it was a completely different trajectory to being in the lab. Like, I had to just get used to sitting at a desk all day as opposed to using a pipette, which was scary enough. But I think identifying where you want to work first and then worry about the role, I think, is probably what I would say, as opposed to finding a role and then making it suit to the industry. You might find that you're in conflicting areas. So just to put that into perspective, I knew I wanted to work at Illumina because I believed in their mission, and I believed in what they did and how they went about it, and their core values. And so I think it's just, and then it didn't really matter what I did at Illumina at that time. I just knew that as soon as I can work that out. And I was okay with that type of ambiguity. I guess it wouldn't be the same for others, but that would be my piece of advice.
Great. Anyone else want to chime in?
I will, from my very limited knowledge, considering I stayed in academia. But in my previous life, I found it really helpful as well to definitely don't limit yourself in terms of what you want to apply for. If you think that, I'm not quite qualified for this, go for it anyway, definitely. And I definitely recommend, in the interview process, once you're there, be really honest about what you want and where you want to go. Because you might find that maybe the position that they're currently interviewing you for isn't quite the right fit, but they might even have something else. That actually happened to me, and that was how I jumped into my publishing career. I interviewed for one position and they said, don't know about that, but hey, we have something that's going and we think it's perfect for you. And so, just be open and honest and see what happens.
Yeah, I often, having worked in HR in a previous life myself, the position description that is posted is sometimes, like we always say, it's kind of the unicorn. We know that this person doesn't really exist, but this is what we really want. And so if you read a job description or a position description, you're like, oh, I like it, but I don't have everything. I say apply for it. If you're passionate about it, if it really connects with where you want to go ahead and apply. What's the worst thing to do? Say no. Okay, but you might actually get a foot in the door. Like Christina is saying, it's an entry. They might have another position that, like they'll see your passion, your commitment, your enthusiasm, and oh, this job may not be the right one, but look at that. And I've seen that happen many times. And so if you're interested and passionate about that role, go and apply, even though you may not hit all the boxes. Anything else before I move on to the question from the audience here? So this is from John Cam. This may be more towards Nick also, just, we don't know. Well, I shouldn't say that. Has anyone on the panel investigated quantum computing and its applications?
Yeah, no, I guess that's me. Not to be honest, no, it's one of the things which is outside of my ability, despite intense curiosity to sort of get across everything. Look, I think all I can really say about quantum computing is just the general. I think it's an emerging area. It's an emerging area within the university. I know that's a sort of a recognized target for both increasing education and research in that area, both across the School of Computing and Information Systems and also in the School of Physics. And so I think the challenges for quantum computing now are really just it's at the cusp of sort of realizing its potential to sort of be translated out of the lab and out of science and into sort of applications. But exciting story, but not one that I'm a part of at the moment.
Okay, well, I think as we are, drawing into the time here, I want to ask one more question for all of you to kind of go around. And that is, knowing what you know about science, industry, jobs, what piece of advice or final thought would you share to a student or a recent graduate coming into the market?
Nick, I saw you took your mic off first.
Quick draw with the unmute, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, look, I'll jump in. I'm going to target this at students, and I would say to really sort of trust your instincts in terms of what you're interested in and what you're curious about. One thing I find is when I've sort of been in my role as course advisor for students is I often get these questions about like, well, I'm doing a major in computer science. What's the best set of subjects I can do as my electives alongside that? And the reality is that there's no best set of subjects, and I think it's natural for some students to sort of feel like they want to kind of optimize their degree to have the best possible outcome. But I genuinely believe that you're much better off going, hey, while I'm at university, this is kind of like a maybe a 3 times in a lifetime opportunity. What would I really like to do while I'm here? I think in terms of those general skills that we talked about before, you're likely to get a lot more value out of studying something that you're really interested in and passionate about. And you're likely to do much better at it and have a lot more fun. And it's impossible to predict exactly what's going to be useful sort of 5-10 years down the track when you come to looking for a job. So I think you want to kind of have a good time along the way, and remember that this isn't necessarily your only chance. Learning is increasingly sort of lifelong, and if you need specific technical skills later on, there's probably going to be an avenue to pick them up. I think picking up those general skills via engaging in a subject that you really care about is definitely the bit of advice that I would give.
Excellent, thank you.
I might go back and reference someone who told me this at uni. She was a lecturer, and she said that, and Nick, I think you said this today, that, or maybe it was David, that the jobs, maybe it was Stacey, but basically the jobs of the future are not necessarily here today. And someone said something along those lines to me when I was at uni, and I thought that, like, whatever, they were just saying that to me to make me feel better. But looking back now, it was honestly the truth, that the jobs that are honestly out there today, didn't even exist at uni. And as much as the University of Melbourne is at the forefront of a lot of the emerging markets, we can't predict the future. And so you never know if you get a job and where that will take you. And I think just not putting that pressure on yourself, I think is really important. Your first job isn't your last job. And as long as you just keep an open mind, it's okay to pivot. And it's okay to go back to uni or do something completely different. And it's pretty daunting to finish uni and possibly not have something, you know, I worked at surf, dive and ski while I was at uni. You know, I should have worked at somewhere else, but it didn't really matter because I learned, oh, that's cringeworthy. But I learned customer service, you know, and who would have thought I was going to be in sales, you know, all those years later. So you know, just baby steps. You got to walk before you got to run.
That's great. Stacey, yeah.
I guess my only tip is just to keep in mind that when it comes to your career, that there's no wrong answer here. So, you know, everything goes in this. We've talked about it before. There's absolutely non-linear path, and that's okay. That's normal, and just yeah, keep in mind that it's exciting, it's fun most of the time. And just try and keep an open mind, because just because you've made one decision and gone in this pathway doesn't mean you can't branch off or go back or go wherever you want to go. You know, there's no rules.
Yeah, I often am asked by parents and students, like, what's the best major for, you know, the careers of the future? And, you know, especially in our Bachelor of Science, the Faculty of Science, we have 42 different majors to choose from. It's like, oh, which one do I choose? And I always say, you know, I don't always get the best look. Well, when I say this, it's the one that you find the most interesting. It's going to inspire you to want to learn more. And it kind of, you know, echoes what Nick was saying there, is like, just have fun with it. Take advantage of this opportunity. Your only job is to learn, and learn and be inspired by that process. So yeah. And also we're internships. So I often, piece of advice I say is, an internship is 80 to 100 hours. It's not the end of the world. Like, it's better to do an internship in some area that you have maybe a little spark of interest in, because you can do that for a couple, 3 weeks and know, I absolutely hate this and I'm never going to come back to this, as opposed to you got your first job in regulatory compliance and you're like, oh my gosh, I hate regulatory, you know, like, then you're kind of stuck in it for a little bit of time. But take these opportunities to learn and grow and test the waters where you can. So, okay, we've talked about a lot of different things. Any last things you want to comment on that burning platforms we didn't get to talk on before we end it here? Things we've missed? Going. Okay. Well, I want to say thank you to Stacey, Christina, and Nick for your time with us this evening and sharing these really great, interesting, engaging perspectives and thoughts. You know, looking into your crystal balls of the future of what's it going to look like here. Also, thank you to our Deputy Dean, Mick McCarthy, for opening tonight's evening. And I want to say a special thanks to all the team working in the background, managing the Q&A and chat and giving me these questions, keeping me going. So big thanks to them also. And finally, thank you to our wonderful online audience for logging on to hear our discussion and for adding in some really engaging questions. And so this is our final for 2022 Science at Melbourne lecture series. Will return again in 2023 for another exciting suite of events. And we look forward to seeing you there too. So we'll bring this fireside without the fireside chat to an end. And thank you so much and have a good night.
And thanks to you as well, David. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.